Welcome to another edition of the Boring Files series. Tonight, we will be discussing the paperclip. Yes, the paperclip, a small piece of bent wire that has managed to avoid any serious attention from historians, which makes it the perfect subject for us. And because this is YouTube, I'm contractually obligated to say, please like this video and subscribe. Some channels ask you to comment where you're from. I'll spare you that, unless you feel strongly about announcing your current location to strangers. Now you might be thinking, surely there isn't enough to say about paperclips to fill an entire evening. And you would be correct. Unfortunately, that has never stopped us before. If we can spend 2 hours on sand, there's no reason we can't do the same for bent wire. The paperclip is, on the surface, unimpressive. It has no moving parts, no colourful history of invention, and no famous names attached to it. Yet somehow it has become essential, appearing in every desk drawer, office supply cabinet, and forgotten box at the back of your closet. Its greatest achievement may be that it has never once been interesting. In the course of this narration, we will examine its non-dramatic rise to ubiquity, the petty squabbles over who invented it, the endless patents that tried and failed to improve it, and the rare occasions it accidentally wandered into world events. Along the way, we'll be asking the question no one has ever asked before. How boring can one object truly be? And to begin, let's do what no one has ever felt the need to do at a party: define the paperclip. A paperclip is, in the most literal sense, a loop of wire bent in such a way that it holds papers together through nothing more than friction and tension. That's it. There are no moving parts, no hidden mechanics, and certainly no drama. It is a product of minimal ambition, a tool that does almost nothing, yet somehow does it well enough to remain unchanged for over a century. The modern standard is called the gem clip, a double oval of wire about 33 millimeters long. Most are made from mild steel, though brass and plastic-coated versions exist for people who need their paperwork to be color-coded or possibly festive. The wire itself is about 1 millimeter thick, which is just enough to hold 10 sheets of paper before it either slips off or bends permanently out of shape. In other words, the paperclip is not designed for greatness, but for adequacy. Compared to other fastening devices, its lack of commitment is striking. A staple punctures. Glue bonds permanently. Pins stab through the page. A paperclip merely hugs the edge and hopes for the best. It's temporary by design, the fastening equivalent of maybe. This is perhaps why it has triumphed in offices, not because it is strong, but because it is harmless. You can clip, unclip, and reclip without leaving a mark. The paperclip is the Switzerland of stationery. Its success lies in being obvious, so obvious that the gem clip was never even patented, while more complicated designs filled the record books and promptly disappeared. Inventors added little teeth, extra spirals, even tiny hooks, all in the name of improvement. None lasted. The plain loop of bent wire outcompeted them all by offering the one thing they lacked: indifference. It was good enough, and good enough was all anyone wanted. If you've ever asked a paperclip to hold more than a small stack of pages, you already know its limits. But perhaps that's the point. The paperclip never promised permanence or even reliability. It promised something closer to, this will probably stay together until you bump it. For most paperwork, that was more than enough. So what is a paperclip? It is the simplest possible answer to a problem nobody was desperate to solve. A bent piece of wire that became indispensable precisely because it tried so little. And with that definition in place, we can step back to a time before the paperclip existed, when humanity had to rely on pins, ribbons, and wax seals to keep its papers from flying apart. The first solution for holding papers together was string. Bundles of parchment were tied with cord, ribbon, or strips of leather. It was secure but hardly efficient. Anyone who needed to glance at a single page had to undo the knot, reshuffle the stack, and then tie it back again. A simple review of documents could turn into a minor exercise in rope work. Pins offered a faster alternative. By the 1700s, small brass pins were sold for fastening papers, and they did their job if you ignored the side effects. Pages ended up covered in small holes, and office workers occasionally found their fingers in the same condition. The method was reliable, but it carried a constant risk of minor injury. Staples eventually arrived as a sturdier fix, but with their own flaw: permanence. Once stapled, pages were bound together in something resembling matrimony. The union could be undone only with effort, and often with damage. Another common method was sealing wax. Important documents were tied, folded, and closed with wax imprints. This was less about convenience and more about authority. Wax could prove a message had not been tampered with, but once broken, the seal was useless. It was secure, ceremonial, and hopelessly inconvenient for anything beyond royal decrees. By the 19th century, with more paper flooding into offices than ever before, new methods appeared. Some clerks used ribbons threaded through punched holes. Others used brass fasteners or filing prongs. These worked, but they were fiddly, slow, and often over-engineered for the simple task of keeping a few sheets together. Filing systems grew elaborate, while efficiency lagged behind. In short, life before the paperclip was one long series of unsatisfying compromises. The available tools either stabbed, burned, glued, or tied documents into submission. None of them were reversible, and all of them required more effort than seemed reasonable for keeping papers from drifting apart. It is almost surprising that no one thought sooner of simply bending a wire into a loop. Which brings us to the next step in the story: the first crude attempts to do exactly that. The first attempts at bending wire into shapes suitable for holding paper began in the mid-19th century, during a period when office work was rapidly expanding. More paper meant more problems with keeping it organized, and inventors started to look for solutions that didn't involve wax, string, or puncture wounds. The idea was straightforward. Take a single piece of wire, bend it into a loop, and let tension do the work. In practice, however, this simple concept produced a long parade of awkward designs. One of the earliest patents came in 1867 from Samuel B. Fay, who proposed a wire clip primarily intended for attaching tickets to fabric. His invention could hold paper as well, but only as an afterthought. It looked more like a fishing hook than a modern paperclip, and while technically functional, it was never widely adopted. Still, Fay set the stage by proving that a bent wire could serve as a fastening device. Other inventors soon followed. Earlman J. Wright patented a design in 1877 that more closely resembled what we would recognize as a clip, with multiple loops to increase friction. Unfortunately, it was complicated to produce and not particularly convenient to use. Wire was cheap, but bending it into complex shapes was not. These designs entered the patent office with enthusiasm and exited into obscurity. The late 19th century saw dozens of similar efforts. Some clips resembled spirals, Others looked like miniature springs, and a few appeared to be inspired by mousetraps. All promised better grip, but most delivered only frustration. Many were so difficult to slide onto paper that they created new problems instead of solving old ones. It turns out that a fastening device, which requires 2 hands, firm pressure, and occasional swearing, is less than ideal for clerical use. The patent records from this period read like a catalogue of overthinking. Inventors added teeth, ridges, and overlapping loops, all in the name of progress. In reality, they were competing to see who could make the least convenient version of the simplest idea imaginable. The story of early bent wire clips is less about ingenuity than about humanity's relentless urge to complicate what works best in its most boring form. Still, these experiments mattered. They established that a loop of wire could indeed hold paper together without glue, wax, or puncturing metal. The prototypes were clumsy, but they set the groundwork for the design that would eventually dominate. In hindsight, the path was obvious. Strip away the extra loops, discard the teeth, and keep only the bare minimum required for tension and friction. Thus, before the gem clip quietly took over, the world endured a brief but memorable age of wire contraptions, designs that are now footnotes in the patent office, remembered only by historians and, unfortunately, by anyone listening to this narration. Amidst the parade of failed patents and overcomplicated wire contraptions, one design emerged that quietly outlasted them all. It wasn't patented, it wasn't promoted with fanfare, and it didn't claim to revolutionize office work. It simply existed, and it worked. This was the gem clip, the double oval of wire that remains the standard paperclip to this day. The gem clip first appeared in Britain in the late 19th century, likely produced by the Gem Manufacturing Company around the 1890s. Unlike the spirals, hooks, and spring-loaded monstrosities that came before it, the gem clip was almost aggressively plain. 2 rounded loops, one nested inside the other, provided just enough friction to hold papers without tearing or slipping. There were no teeth, no added ridges, no claims of superior strength. Its main feature was that it wasn't trying very hard. The lack of a patent is one of its most telling details. While inventors were rushing to secure rights to increasingly complex clips, the gem slipped into circulation with no paperwork at all, which, given the subject matter, feels almost poetic. The design was so obvious, so minimal, that no one could convincingly argue they had invented it. It was as if the paperclip had been waiting all along, and humanity finally stumbled across the right way to bend a wire. Manufacturing helped seal its dominance. The gem's simple shape could be mass-produced quickly and cheaply, without the fiddly curves of earlier designs. Wire could be fed into machines, bent twice, and released as a finished product in seconds. In a market where efficiency mattered, this simplicity translated directly into adoption. By the early 20th century, the gem clip was everywhere, in offices, schools, libraries, and government archives. The more complex patents were left behind, admired by no one but patent examiners. The effectiveness of the gem clip was not that it gripped especially tightly, or that it could handle large stacks of paper. It was that it struck the perfect balance between good enough and not annoying. It held without puncturing, slipped on without effort, and could be reused indefinitely until it bent out of shape. It was the middle ground between permanence and uselessness, which, in office work, is exactly where most tools thrive. There's something almost disappointing about its success. After decades of inventors adding extra loops and spikes, the winning design turned out to be the one that looked as though the inventor got bored halfway through. The gem clip is an icon, not because it is brilliant, but because it is stubbornly adequate. And adequacy, it turns out, is often the highest compliment in the world of stationery. From here, the paperclip would begin its quiet conquest of desks around the globe, but not without disputes over who deserved the credit. Which brings us, inevitably, to the small wars fought over patents and recognition. For every gem clip that slipped quietly into desk drawers, there were dozens of other paperclip designs that never quite made the cut. The United States Patent Office in the late 19th and early 20th centuries became a museum of well-intentioned but hopelessly awkward ideas. Each inventor seemed convinced that the problem of fastening paper demanded not simplicity, but elaboration. One patent featured a clip with tiny serrated teeth, meant to dig into the fibers of the paper for extra grip. It succeeded in holding the sheets and in shredding them in the process. Another added a coiled spring to provide tension. It held firmly, but also had the charming tendency to launch itself across the room if handled carelessly. A triangular version claimed superior strength, though sliding it onto a page required the determination of someone forcing a key into the wrong lock. Inventors experimented with spirals, zigzags, hooks, and overlapping loops. Some looked like musical instruments, others like fishing tackle. One resembled a miniature bear trap, which is a bold statement for something intended to keep invoices together. Each promised improvements over the ordinary loop, but almost all shared a fatal flaw. They were either too expensive to manufacture or too irritating to use. Patent drawings from this era are unintentionally comic. They show elaborate twists of wire accompanied by solemn descriptions of their innovative gripping action. The reality was less impressive. A clerk fumbling through stacks of paper had little patience for innovations that required two hands, careful alignment, or a small act of courage. Office supplies, after all, are judged not by their ingenuity, but by how quietly they disappear into routine. It is tempting to feel sympathy for these inventors. They were not wrong in thinking that holding papers together mattered. They were simply wrong in assuming that progress meant more wire, more angles, and more cleverness. The gem clip triumphed precisely because it abandoned all of those improvements and settled for being as boring as possible. Today, the patent archives are littered with these forgotten shapes. They stand as a reminder that innovation is not always rewarded, and that sometimes the market prefers indifference over genius. If you were hoping for a grand story of rivalry and invention, you may be disappointed to learn that most of these designs were forgotten before they ever reached a stationery store, which, for our purposes, makes them perfect material. Having admired the losers, we can now turn to the raw material that made them possible, the wire itself, because even the simplest clip depends entirely on what it's made of. If the shape of the paperclip settled the question of design, its material decided whether it would actually work. A clip, after all, is nothing more than wire under tension. Too soft, and it bends uselessly. Too hard, and it snaps. The history of paperclips is therefore also a history of the wires chosen to make them. Most standard clips are made of mild steel, drawn into wire about 1 millimeter thick. This size strikes the awkward balance between strong enough to pinch 10 sheets of paper and weak enough to bend permanently if you look at it too sternly. Steel provided consistency and, more importantly, low cost. It was the reliable middle child of metals, unremarkable in every way except availability. Brass and copper wire were also used, particularly in the early 20th century. These versions were softer, more expensive, and preferred mainly in offices that wanted their paperwork to look distinguished. A brass clip did not hold better. It simply gleamed faintly, suggesting that someone in management had approved the stationery order. Aluminum was occasionally tried, but proved too flimsy, the fastening equivalent of relying on wet pasta. Plastic coatings arrived later, in the mid-20th century, marketed as colourful, modern, and less likely to rust. In practice, they provided little more than novelty. A red or green clip did the same job as a steel one, except more festively. The coatings did, however, prevent rust stains from bleeding onto documents, which might be the closest the paperclip has ever come to a genuine technical improvement. Wire gauge mattered just as much as material. Thin wire bent too easily, turning a single enthusiastic shuffle of papers into a twisted scrap of metal. Thick wire provided better grip, but made the clip harder to slide on. The ideal thickness was discovered not through bold experimentation, but through years of quiet compromise. The current standard exists because it is the size at which most people stop complaining. Even the surface finish became a point of consideration. Galvanized coatings reduced corrosion. Nickel-plated wire offered a smoother slide. None of this transformed the clip into anything remarkable, but it did keep the industry occupied in pretending that incremental changes mattered. If there is any lesson in the materials of paperclips, it is that adequacy is enough. The steel clip held just firmly enough, bent just reluctantly enough, and rusted just slowly enough to keep its place on the desk. More glamorous metals and brighter coatings came and went, but steel wire in its modest thickness endured. And once the right material was chosen, the next logical step was to bend it not by hand, but by machine, producing clips in quantities so large that they became practically unavoidable. The adoption of the gem clip created a new problem: supply. Offices weren't content with a handful of clips made on demand. They wanted boxes, hundreds at a time, ready to spill across desks and filing cabinets. Meeting that expectation required something more ambitious than bending wire by hand. By the early 20th century, factories in Europe and the United States had installed specialized machines designed solely to churn out clips. Long spools of steel wire were drawn through guides, cut to precise lengths, and bent into the double oval shape in a matter of seconds. Each finished clip dropped neatly into a tray, identical to the one before it. A single machine could produce tens of thousands in a day, enough to keep even the most paperwork-heavy bureaucracy comfortably supplied. The routine was monotonous but effective. Operators kept the spools loaded, cleared jams when they occurred, and packed the finished product into boxes. Despite the scale of production, one part of the process remained stubbornly human: scooping handfuls of clips into small cardboard containers. No machine was ever designed to replace this gesture, which was probably for the best, as even a clumsy worker could accomplish it with reasonable accuracy. Standardization became the industry's guiding principle. The majority of machines were tuned to produce the 33mm gem clip, along with a smaller 28mm variant. Other experimental designs occasionally passed through production lines, but customers showed little interest in paying extra for novelty shapes. Uniformity, predictability, and low cost carried the day. The atmosphere in a paperclip factory was not dramatic. There were no roaring furnaces or towering smokestacks, only the steady clatter of wire being bent into loops at industrial speed. What impressed visitors was not the machinery itself, but the sheer volume. By mid-century, the world was awash in paperclips. They were so cheap and so plentiful that the real challenge became losing them fast enough to justify buying more. Mass production guaranteed that paperclips would no longer be curiosities or niche office gadgets. They were now permanent fixtures, as much a part of daily paperwork as ink and envelopes. With supply secured, the stage was set for the paperclip's quiet rise from factory output to everyday necessity. By the time paperclips were spilling out of factories in the early 20th century, their destination was clear: the office. Bureaucracies were multiplying, businesses were growing, and schools were churning out more paperwork than ever. The paperclip fit neatly into this expanding world of paper management, sliding into place as if the modern office had been waiting for it all along. Clerks quickly learned to prefer clips over the older methods. Pins tore pages, staples required force, and string took time. The clip, by contrast, asked for nothing but a quick slide across the edge of the paper. A pile of documents could be joined, separated and rejoined without ceremony. For workers buried under ledgers and correspondence, this small convenience made a noticeable difference. The speed of paperwork in the early 1900s was staggering compared to the centuries before. Governments processed tax forms by the tens of thousands. Businesses tracked inventories in thick ledgers, and schools generated endless reports. In each setting, clips multiplied as fast as the paper they managed. A drawer without a box of them was considered ill-equipped. Losing a paperclip was not a crisis. There were always more waiting. Advertising materials from the era reflect both practicality and boredom. Companies proudly marketed their clips as rust-resistant, smooth-sliding, and economical. None of these qualities inspired excitement, but they reassured buyers that their paperwork would remain intact without undue frustration. The selling point was not innovation, but reliability, a rare product that was exactly as dull as it appeared. The rise of the clip also changed filing practices. Documents could be grouped temporarily, sorted and shuffled without damage. Accountants clipped receipts together, teachers clipped essays, and government clerks clipped reports for their supervisors. The result was not just efficiency, but a sense of control over the growing flood of information. If modern civilization runs on paperwork, then the paperclip was its quiet, uncredited stagehand. What makes this period remarkable is not the invention itself, but the fact that millions of people adopted it without fanfare. Few tools achieve such universal acceptance without controversy. The typewriter sparked debates over handwriting, and the telephone unsettled people unused to voices without faces. The paperclip, on the other hand, met no resistance. No one wrote editorials condemning bent wire. It slipped into daily life so quietly that people barely noticed it had arrived. The office revolution wasn't loud, but it was real. Work became slightly faster, slightly neater, and slightly less frustrating. That modest contribution explains the paperclip's survival. It never claimed to change the world, but it made one corner of it more tolerable. From this point forward, the paperclip was not just an object, but an assumption. And nowhere was that assumption more obvious than in the vast bureaucracies that depended on it. Governments have a way of turning even the simplest tools into instruments of ritual, and the paperclip was no exception. Once introduced into bureaucratic systems, it became more than stationery. It became policy. Regulations, reports, and forms all passed through the quiet grip of bent wire, and clerks developed routines that revolved around these tiny fasteners. In many offices, paper clips were rationed. Boxes were stored in supply closets, signed out by the handful, and logged in ledgers. Administrators feared that clerks would waste them, or worse, take them home. Memos circulated reminding staff that clips were to be reused whenever possible. It was not unusual to see a pile of bent, slightly rusted clips sitting in a dish on a supervisor's desk, waiting for a second tour of duty. The life of a paperclip in a government office was not glamorous, but it was rarely short. Archives reveal the scale of their importance. World War I correspondence in Britain and America often survives today, with the original paperclips still attached, faint rust marks left behind as evidence of their service. Inspecting these files gives the impression that entire wars were managed by nothing more than stubborn steel loops holding orders and receipts together. The irony, of course, is that an empire's fate might have rested on a clip that could barely manage 10 pages before losing its shape. Clerical culture also elevated the clip into a symbol of diligence. A neat stack of documents secured with a clip suggested competence, while loose pages hinted at carelessness. Supervisors measured workers not only by output, but by the tidiness of their files. Paperclips became the silent judges of bureaucratic virtue, rewarding order and punishing disorder with the slow slide of papers onto the floor. The obsession occasionally crossed into the absurd. In the 1930s, one US government office reportedly spent months debating whether it was more cost-effective to reuse clips or purchase them in bulk. The savings amounted to pennies, but the paperwork generated by the debate almost certainly required additional clips to keep it organized. Bureaucracy has always had a talent for making small things seem very large, and the paperclip was a perfect partner in this exercise. What makes this fixation notable is how unremarkable it seemed to those involved. No clerk wrote poems about the paperclip, but they relied on it daily. No policy celebrated its role, yet entire systems assumed its presence. The clip had become invisible, which in bureaucracy is the ultimate compliment. From bureaucratic corridors, the clip's reach extended beyond borders, spreading into offices around the world, each nation adopting it in its own quiet way. While governments hoarded and rationed their clips, other nations were quietly adopting them on a global scale. The spread of the paperclip mirrored the spread of modern administration itself. Wherever there were papers to shuffle, the clip soon followed. Factories in Britain, Germany, and the United States all produced their own versions, and the results began circulating through trade networks almost as invisibly as the product itself. In Europe, the gem clip became the default by the early 1900s. German firms manufactured them by the ton, stamping their boxes with austere lettering that promised dependability without flourish. French manufacturers, predictably, tried to make theirs more stylish, offering brass-plated clips that suggested a certain continental refinement. Scandinavia, meanwhile, became unexpectedly central to the mythology of the clip, thanks to the popular but inaccurate claim that a Norwegian, Johan Vaaler, invented it. While Vaaler did patent a design, it was clumsier than the gem and never widely used. Still, Norway proudly embraced the legend, and to this day, the paperclip remains an unlikely national symbol. Across the Atlantic, American offices took to the clip with predictable enthusiasm. The country's ballooning corporate sector demanded quick, disposable solutions to paperwork, and the paperclip fit the bill perfectly. By the 1920s, advertisements in US stationery catalogues were pitching paperclips not as luxuries, but as bare necessities, alongside ink and envelopes. The clip became one more cog in the relentless efficiency of American business culture. Elsewhere, adoption was slower but steady. Colonies administered by European powers received boxes of clips along with typewriters and carbon paper. Local bureaucrats soon found themselves using the same bent wire as their colonial overseers, another small but telling example of imported office culture. By the mid-20th century, the paperclip had become so common worldwide that its origins barely mattered. What's striking is how little debate surrounded its global takeover. Other Western exports, railroads, telegraphs, telephones, often met resistance or required heavy promotion. The paperclip needed no convincing. No government commission debated its merits. No philosopher warned of its dangers. It slipped across borders as quietly as it slipped onto paper. The result was near universal adoption. From Berlin to Boston, Paris to Pretoria, the same double loop of wire was holding papers together. It was perhaps the least controversial example of globalization in history. And with its international position secured, the paperclip was ready for its most unusual role yet. Not as stationery, but as a symbol of wartime resistance. In peacetime, the paperclip was nothing more than a tool for holding invoices together. During the Second World War, it acquired a second life as a symbol of defiance. Nowhere was this more visible than in Norway, where the paperclip took on a meaning far larger than its modest shape suggested. When Germany occupied Norway in 1940, public displays of dissent were dangerous. Flags, slogans, or any open symbol of resistance could lead to arrest. The paperclip, however, offered something subtler. Small enough to pass unnoticed by guards, ordinary enough to seem harmless, it became a quiet badge of solidarity. Norwegians began wearing paperclips on their lapels as a way of showing opposition to the occupation and loyalty to one another. The choice was not random. The paperclip had already been embraced in Norway as a kind of national invention, thanks to Johan Wahler's little-known but widely celebrated patent. Even though his design was never the one that actually caught on, the myth endured. Wearing a clip was therefore both practical and patriotic, a way to signal quiet rebellion under the cover of national pride. German authorities eventually caught on. By 1941, wearing a paperclip could attract unwanted attention from soldiers, and the practice was officially banned. That only strengthened its meaning. Something as dull as bent wire had become threatening, not because it was dangerous, but because it was visible proof that people could resist without shouting. The very ordinariness of the object made it impossible to stamp out completely. Stories from the period describe classrooms where students wore clips on their jackets, offices where clerks pinned them to their ties, and public squares where a glimpse of steel on a lapel was enough to lift morale. It was a reminder that the occupation, no matter how heavy-handed, had not silenced everyone. The paperclip was cheap, replaceable, and perfectly ordinary, yet in that ordinariness, it carried weight. The irony is striking. An object designed to avoid notice in paperwork became dangerous precisely because it drew notice on clothing. The same clip that kept memos together could, in the right context, land its wearer in jail. Few objects in history have moved so quickly from invisible to subversive. Norway's use of the paperclip as resistance was unique, but it illustrates how meaning can be attached to even the most boring objects when circumstances demand it. For the occupiers, it was a trivial nuisance. For those resisting, it was a quiet way to say, "We are still here." From quiet streets in Oslo to classrooms filled with clipped lapels, the paperclip proved it could carry more weight symbolically than it ever did physically. But its involvement in wartime did not end there. In a different context, the word paperclip would soon acquire a far darker association, one tied not to protest, but to espionage and secrecy. Far from the streets of occupied Norway, the word paperclip found itself attached to something much larger and considerably less innocent. At the end of the Second World War, the United States launched a secret program to recruit German scientists, many of whom had worked on advanced weapons and rocketry for the Nazi regime. The project needed a name, and in the grand tradition of government code words, it was assigned one with no obvious connection to its purpose: Operation Paperclip. The choice came from the practice of attaching a paperclip to the files of scientists marked for transfer. Those with clips were moved to the front of the pile, a bureaucratic shorthand that, through repetition, gave the entire operation its name. It was a fittingly dull label for a program that was anything but. The United States was quietly importing expertise that would shape everything from space exploration to the Cold War arms race. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were relocated to America under this initiative. Among them was Werner von Braun, who had developed the V-2 rocket for Germany and would later become a central figure in NASA's Apollo program. The irony of a man who once designed weapons for the Third Reich, later helping put Americans on the moon, was not lost on historians, though at the time it was considered a pragmatic necessity. For a program of such magnitude, the name remained stubbornly underwhelming. Military operations often carry dramatic titles: Overlord, Torch, Desert Storm. Paperclip sounded more like an office supply order than a geopolitical gambit. Perhaps that was intentional. A file marked Operation Paperclip would draw less attention than one labelled Operation Import German Rocket Experts. Secrecy thrives on dullness. The contrast with Norway's use of the clip is striking. There, it had symbolized resistance and quiet unity. In Washington, it became shorthand for absorbing former enemies into American laboratories. The same bent wire that had once signaled patriotism in the lapel was now a marker in the folders of intelligence officers. Few objects or words have had such opposite symbolic lives in the span of a decade. Looking back, the name almost trivializes the scale of what was happening. The fate of nuclear research, missile technology, and space exploration was bundled under the banner of an office accessory. It is difficult to imagine history books referring with equal seriousness to Operation Stapler or Operation Hole Punch, but in essence that is what occurred. For the paperclip itself, of course, nothing changed. On factory floors it continued to bend wire into loops. In offices it continued to hold memos together. But in the shadows of Cold War politics, the word gained a second definition, one far removed from stationery, yet bound to it forever. And while the geopolitical paperclip shaped the future of science, the ordinary paperclip was busy returning to its natural habitat, the cluttered drawers of everyday life, where it resumed its modest struggle against slipping pages. For all their ubiquity, paperclips are far from flawless. Anyone who has relied on one for more than a modest stack of documents knows its tendency to fail at the precise moment it is needed most. The problem lies not in the concept, but in the physics. A paperclip holds papers together by tension and friction alone, and both have strict limits. The average gem clip is designed to handle roughly 10 sheets of standard office paper. Beyond that, the pressure of the wire is spread too thinly, and the stack begins to slide free. Push it further, and the clip itself bends, losing its shape permanently. At that point, it transitions from useful tool to small piece of twisted scrap metal, destined for the recycling bin, or more often, the office carpet. Slippage is not the only failure. Occasionally the clip digs into the paper, leaving crescent-shaped impressions that resemble tiny bite marks. This is especially common when the clip is reused after being bent out of shape. It still holds, but not quite where you want it to. Documents can emerge looking as though they have been nibbled by an inattentive rodent. Another familiar problem is the paper fan effect. When too many sheets are forced into a clip, they bulge outward at the edges, creating a curved wedge rather than a neat stack. The papers remain technically attached, but are about as orderly as laundry pulled hastily from a dryer. Clerks learned quickly that there is a fine line between fastening and merely pinching papers together in defiance of gravity. The metal itself is also prone to fatigue. Bend a clip once and it performs as expected. Bend it a second or third time, and the structural integrity starts to give way. Many people have discovered this during meetings, absent-mindedly twisting a clip until it breaks. At that point, the device has failed both as a fastener and as a distraction. Engineers have studied these shortcomings in surprising detail. Friction coefficients, tensile strength, and wire elasticity all play roles in the performance of a clip. Solutions exist: thicker wire, sharper angles, or textured surfaces, but they come at the cost of convenience. The elegance of the gem lies in being barely good enough. Improving it too much risks creating something else entirely, which history has shown will almost certainly be ignored. Failures, then, are part of the design. The paperclip was never intended for permanence or heavy lifting. It was built to manage only what could be managed easily: small stacks, temporary bundles, pages destined to be separated again. Its weakness is not a flaw but a feature, one that has kept it in circulation precisely because it never promised more than it could deliver. And while individuals cursed their slipping documents, offices discovered a more systemic truth. The paperclip was only one member of a larger cast of tools, each competing for a place in the desk drawer. Open almost any desk drawer, and you'll find not just paperclips, but their rivals: staples, rubber bands, push pins, and the occasional binder clip. Together, they form a kind of miniature ecosystem, each tool adapted to a specific niche in the struggle against loose paper. The paperclip holds its own here, but only by embracing modesty. Staples represent brute force. With a crunch of metal, they pierce the page and bind sheets together permanently. For legal documents or records destined for storage, the staple is unmatched. Its downside is commitment. Once applied, removing it requires prying, tearing, or an awkward wrestling match with a staple remover that never quite works. If the paperclip is the diplomat of the drawer, the staple is its soldier. Rubber bands take a different approach. Instead of fastening at a single point, they encircle entire stacks, clamping them into tight bundles. They are versatile, inexpensive, and prone to snapping without warning. Every office has a story of a rubber band that turned into a miniature slingshot, injuring dignity if not fingers. Despite these hazards, bands remain useful for corralling bulkier piles of paper that no clip could hope to manage. Pushpins, though not designed for fastening pages to one another, are often pressed into service anyway. Their strength lies in attaching papers to walls or corkboards, which they do by stabbing holes directly through the page. This is effective for visibility, less so for preservation. A notice posted with pushpins rarely survives the process gracefully. Binder clips occupy the heavyweight category, larger, stronger, and more intimidating than paper clips. They can hold dozens of sheets securely. They also carry an air of seriousness, as though the documents they bind must be important simply because they required a larger piece of hardware. The trade-off is bulk. A binder clip adds weight and thickness, turning a slim file into a small metal-jawed package. Against this competition, the paperclip offers something none of the others quite manage: harmless impermanence. It does not puncture like a staple, crush like a band, or overwhelm like a binder clip. It is the placeholder of the drawer, perfect for documents that may or may not deserve to stay together. In an environment where every tool has its strengths and failings, the paperclip succeeds by failing quietly. Taken together, the drawer tells a story of human compromise. No single device solves the problem of paper once and for all. Instead, workers accumulate an arsenal of small, specialized tools and reach for whichever one feels least annoying at the moment. The paperclip remains the most common, not because it is the best, but because it is the least objectionable. And while the clip was busy proving its adequacy in drawers around the world, it also began to appear outside the office entirely, slipping into popular culture as a symbol, a metaphor, and eventually a cartoon character. For an object designed to avoid notice, the paperclip has managed to insert itself into culture in surprising ways. Its plain shape and constant presence made it an easy metaphor, a background prop, and occasionally even a celebrity in its own right. Most office supplies live quiet, thankless lives. The paperclip, against all odds, became recognizable. Writers and journalists often borrowed it as shorthand for bureaucracy. A paperclip economy, or a paperclip shuffle, conjured the image of endless paperwork with nothing meaningful accomplished. The metaphor worked precisely because it was so boring. Few people actually admire paperclips, so the word carried just the right sense of futility. Literature and film occasionally gave the clip cameo roles. Desk scenes almost always included a scattering of them, reinforcing the authenticity of the office setting. Some thrillers even elevated them into tools of improvisation, picking locks, jamming switches, or shorting out circuits. The same clip that struggled to hold 10 sheets of paper together suddenly became a miracle device in the hands of a resourceful protagonist. Reality, of course, is less glamorous. Most attempts to pick a lock with a paperclip end in frustration, a bent wire, and the quiet acknowledgement that movie heroes make it look much easier. Perhaps the most famous cultural appearance came not in literature, but in software. In the late 1990s, Microsoft introduced Clippy, an animated paperclip that offered unsolicited advice in Microsoft Office. Intended as a helpful assistant, it quickly became one of the most disliked mascots in computing history. Users found its wide eyes and unhelpful suggestions more irritating than endearing. Clippy's persistence earned it a strange kind of fame, but also cemented its reputation as proof that not everything needs personality. The fact that the most memorable paperclip in popular culture was a cartoon nuisance feels oddly appropriate. the object has also been co-opted by art. Sculptors and designers have built giant paperclip installations, some tens of feet high, as commentaries on modern life and bureaucracy. The irony of turning a tool of invisibility into a towering public monument has not been lost on critics. It is difficult to think of another office supply that has inspired both resistance movements and outdoor sculptures. What ties these appearances together is not admiration, but familiarity. The paperclip is so universal that anyone, anywhere, recognizes it instantly. That recognition makes it a convenient symbol, whether of office drudgery, improvisation, or failed digital assistance. And while culture found ways to give the clip more personality than it deserved, ordinary people were quietly finding their own uses for it, bending it into lockpicks, sculptures, and emergency gadgets far beyond its original design. The paperclip was never intended to be versatile, yet it has been drafted into countless roles beyond fastening paper. Its appeal lies in being small, cheap, and already bent into a shape that suggests further bending. If there is idle time and a paperclip nearby, chances are it will soon be repurposed. One of the most common improvisations is the reset tool. Countless electronic devices have recessed buttons labeled reset, designed to be pressed with something slender. The paperclip, straightened on one end, became the universal key for this task. Entire generations of routers, calculators, and digital watches have been restarted thanks to bent stationery. Few products advertise compatibility with paperclips, but engineers design those tiny holes with the assumption that someone will eventually fish a clip out of a drawer. Another familiar use is the SIM card ejector. When mobile phones introduced trays for their chips, manufacturers provided special pins to remove them. Users promptly lost the pins, then discovered that a paperclip worked just as well. To this day, sales of paperclips may quietly benefit from the absent-mindedness of phone owners worldwide. Lockpicking has also been associated with paperclips, though less successfully than movies suggest. A determined tinkerer can sometimes coax a cheap lock open with two clips, one serving as a tension wrench and the other as a pick. In practice, most attempts end with frustration, mangled wire, and a lock that is still very much locked. What Hollywood presents as a skill takes locksmiths years to perfect. The paperclip is less a skeleton key and more a symbol of false hope. Creative minds have gone further, turning paperclips into sculptures, jewelry, or chain links. Students have passed idle hours constructing chains that stretch across classrooms. Hobbyists have bent clips into tiny animals, geometric shapes, or crude pieces of wearable art. The results rarely impress anyone outside the maker, but the activity persists, perhaps because the paperclip is one of the few materials that can be wasted without regret. Then there are the purely practical improvisations. A broken zipper pull can be replaced by a clip. Loose eyeglass arms can be temporarily tightened with one. Some people have even used them as makeshift hooks, bookmarks, or toothpick substitutes, though the last is strongly discouraged for reasons of both taste and hygiene. These alternative uses never replaced the clip's primary function, but they added to its reputation as a quiet standby. The object's value lies not in doing any one task perfectly, but in being just barely acceptable at dozens of them. In the right hands, or in desperate circumstances, a paperclip can be almost anything, except, of course, exciting. And as people found personal ways to misuse clips, the broader culture discovered a trend of its own, turning these improvisations into so-called life hacks. At some point in the early 2000s, the paperclip made a leap from quiet improvisation to internet celebrity. Lists and videos promising 50 amazing life hacks with paperclips spread rapidly, presenting the bent wire not as an office supply, but as a universal problem solver. The pitch was always the same. You thought this was boring, but wait until you see what it can do. The claims range from the mildly useful to the outright absurd. A clip could serve as a key ring, a bookmark, a money clip, or a makeshift cable organizer. It could unclog glue bottles, keep chip bags closed, or mark the end of a roll of tape. Some guides grew more ambitious, suggesting clips as fishhooks, hairpins, or emergency cufflinks. The ingenuity was undeniable, though the practicality was debatable. Many hacks worked only in theory, and most required more effort than the problem they were supposed to solve. The presentation often carried a tone of revelation. Demonstrators would straighten a clip, bend it slightly, and announce that it had been transformed into something entirely new. In reality, the results were rarely impressive. A straightened clip is still just a piece of wire, and while it can be coaxed into dozens of shapes, very few of them outperform the tools they are meant to replace. Watching someone use a paperclip as a spoon is less inspiring than it is concerning. The popularity of these hacks says less about the clip and more about human boredom. The paperclip is cheap, abundant, and harmless. It is the ideal candidate for experimentation, and failures carry no cost. A bent clip can be discarded without regret, which makes it perfect material for internet content that thrives on novelty rather than usefulness. Ironically, the spread of paperclip hacks may have done little to change anyone's opinion of the object. It remained what it had always been, adequate at a few tasks, laughably poor at others, and strangely compelling despite itself. The hacks did not elevate the clip so much as confirm its identity as the tool for when nothing else is available. If nothing else, the life hack craze proved that the paperclip is infinitely recyclable in imagination. As long as people have free time, cameras, and the urge to bend wire into new shapes, there will always be another video promising that the paperclip will change your life. It never will, of course, but that hasn't stopped anyone from trying. From these small-scale experiments, the clip would soon find itself drawn into larger spectacles. Not just improvised tricks, but records, collections, and public stunts that pushed its unremarkable design into the spotlight. For all the improvisations dreamed up by bored office workers, manufacturers eventually decided that the clip itself needed reinvention. If people were bending them into shapes anyway, why not sell them pre-bent into something more exciting? Thus began the small but persistent industry of novelty paperclips. The basic idea was simple. Take the same piece of steel wire, but shape it into hearts, stars, triangles, or company logos. The function rarely improved. A star-shaped clip held no more securely than a gem clip, and in some cases worked worse, snagging on edges or bending awkwardly. But they offered something the standard clip never could: variety. For offices weary of grey desks and beige filing cabinets, a pink heart or a neon green triangle seemed like progress. Corporations also seized on novelty clips as promotional tools. Branded clips in the shapes of initials or mascots appeared in marketing campaigns, usually accompanied by slogans about holding it all together. They were handed out at trade shows, tucked into press kits, and distributed in bulk by companies hoping to leave an impression. albeit one that most recipients quietly recycled after the event. The 1990s were a high point for colourful clips. Plastic coatings became more adventurous, producing entire boxes of rainbow assortments. Transparent, glitter-filled clips even made brief appearances, as though stationery had wandered into the school supply aisle. Functionality took a back seat to aesthetics, which is another way of saying the clips were mostly useless but looked cheerful while failing. Some novelty designs reached absurd extremes. There were clips shaped like animals, musical notes, and even miniature spectacles. These creations rarely found homes in offices, but were popular among students, artists, and anyone who thought paperwork could use a little personality. The irony was hard to miss. The one office tool prized for being boring was repeatedly reinvented to be less boring, usually with disappointing results. Collectors and hobbyists occasionally kept novelty clips alive. Specialty shops sold them in small tins or decorative boxes, marketed less as tools and more as curiosities. A handful even turned into limited editions, which is an impressive feat for something that could have been made at home with pliers. In the end, novelty clips confirmed what the gem design had already proven. Boring wins. Offices consistently drifted back to the plain steel oval because it worked reliably and didn't draw attention. Novelty clips were amusing distractions, but they never replaced the quiet adequacy of the standard form. Still, their existence hinted at a trend that would only grow larger: the desire to scale up the paperclip itself, turning it from a pocket-sized tool into something oversized and strange. If novelty clips tried to make the paperclip more interesting by changing its shape, the next logical step was to change its scale. Oversized clips began appearing in offices, classrooms, and exhibitions, tools that looked familiar but operated on an entirely different level. The most common oversized variety is the binder clip, a small steel contraption with black jaws and silver handles. Technically, it isn't a paperclip at all, but its purpose is close enough that most people file it in the same mental drawer. Where the gem clip quietly secures a handful of pages, the binder clip bites down on thick stacks, holding them with grim determination. It is the heavy artillery of the stationery world, and it tends to announce its presence. A folder fastened with a binder clip does not look casual. It looks like someone wanted to make sure those papers would never escape again. Other enlarged versions take the gem design and scale it up dramatically. Desk accessories in the shape of giant paperclips appeared in the mid-20th century, marketed as memo holders or conversation pieces. They were often 8 to 10 inches long, capable of gripping entire notebooks or standing upright on a desk like minimalist sculptures. Their usefulness was debatable, but their resemblance to the familiar clip gave them a certain charm. Public art installations pushed this further. Cities commissioned monumental paperclips, sometimes several feet tall, crafted from metal tubing. These sculptures were less about function than commentary, statements on bureaucracy, repetition, or the humour of treating the most boring of tools as a work of art. Tourists occasionally photographed them, though probably not as often as the artists hoped. Some companies even experimented with absurdly large functioning clips. Promotional stunts produced clips several feet in length, technically capable of holding together sheets of poster board or thin stacks of cardboard. They were spectacularly impractical, but they demonstrated the strange appeal of seeing a small, invisible tool made suddenly impossible to ignore. The irony of bigger clips is that they usually solve problems no one has. The binder clip works well because it fills a niche. Giant gem replicas, however, are less solutions than statements, reminders that even the most modest invention can be exaggerated beyond reason. Their purpose is not to hold paper, but to hold attention, which is the one task the standard paperclip has never attempted. These outsized and unusual versions set the stage for a different kind of fascination: collecting. Once people had seen the clip transformed into objects of art, novelty, and spectacle, it was only a short step before some decided to gather as many varieties as they could. Collecting is usually reserved for objects of beauty, rarity, or historical significance. Stamps carry art, coins carry value, and antiques carry stories. Paperclips carry paper, which makes their appearance in the world of collecting all the more peculiar. Yet even here, the humble clip has found its niche. The most famous example is the Holocaust Memorial Project in Whitwell, Tennessee, where students collected millions of paperclips to represent the victims of the war. What began as a classroom assignment in the late 1990s eventually grew into a global effort, drawing contributions from around the world. By the time it concluded, more than 30 million clips had been gathered, a staggering figure that transformed an ordinary object into a powerful symbol. In this context, the paperclip became more than stationery. It became a collective act of remembrance. Outside of memorials, smaller-scale collecting has its own devotees. Some enthusiasts hunt down antique clips from early patents, odd novelty shapes, or unusual materials. Brass clips, triangular clips, and long discontinued designs all find their way into drawers and display cases. For those inclined toward historical trivia, the Patent Office archives are essentially a shopping list of forgotten varieties waiting to be rediscovered. Companies have occasionally encouraged the impulse. Promotional campaigns offered branded clips in unique shapes, often tucked into tins or boxes meant to be saved. While most recipients discarded them, a few kept them, and over time even these marketing gimmicks turned into collectibles. It takes a special kind of dedication to save and catalogue what most people lose under a couch cushion. But every niche hobby has its champions. Chains and sculptures have also served as a form of collecting by accumulation. Schools and clubs have attempted world records for the longest paperclip chain, linking thousands of clips together in the name of teamwork. The final product is usually too fragile to move and too awkward to display, but it remains a visible testament to persistence. What makes collecting paperclips fascinating is that it defies the usual logic of value. A rare coin may be worth thousands of dollars. A rare paperclip is worth almost nothing. Its value lies only in the attention someone has decided to give it. To collect clips is to embrace their dullness as a feature, not a flaw. To say that even the most forgettable object deserves a place on the shelf. From this peculiar hobby, it was only a short step to the pursuit of records, not just saving clips, but pushing them into feats of quantity and endurance that no single office could ever require. If collecting paperclips revealed dedication, world records revealed ambition. At some point, simply owning unusual clips was not enough. People wanted to prove what could be done with them on a grand scale. The result was a series of record attempts that stretched the object far beyond its original purpose. The most common category was the longest paperclip chain. Schools, clubs, and community groups around the world competed to link thousands, then millions of clips end to end. The process was slow, repetitive, and strangely satisfying, producing chains that stretched across gymnasiums, down streets, and occasionally around entire buildings. None of these chains served a practical function, unless the function was teaching patience, but they did highlight the paperclip's one hidden talent, being endlessly repeatable. Another record involved sheer quantity. Organizations attempted to gather the largest number of paperclips in one place, measured not by boxes but by weight. Some efforts filled rooms with bins of steel, creating a spectacle of abundance that looked less like an achievement and more like an accident in a supply warehouse. Yet the record books dutifully noted each milestone, proof that humanity can assign meaning to even the dullest stockpile. Individual feats also appeared: fastest paperclip linker in a minute, most clips attached to a single sheet of paper, largest paperclip sculpture built within 24 hours. Each record combined a dash of creativity with a healthy dose of pointlessness. Judges from Guinness World Records looked on solemnly, clipboards in hand, themselves held together, one imagines, by paperclips. The absurdity of these records lies not in their difficulty, but in their subject. A chain of lights or dominoes produces spectacle. A chain of paperclips produces a long, wobbly reminder that not all records are worth watching, but participants rarely minded. The goal was not entertainment, but recognition. Proof that even with the most boring of tools, humans can find ways to compete. Records, unlike collections, were not about permanence. Chains were dismantled, piles redistributed, sculptures recycled. What remained was a number in a book, evidence that someone, somewhere, had invested time and effort into elevating bent wire into a moment of glory. From here, the paperclip story returns to less theatrical concerns. Beyond feats of scale, the next challenge was what to do with the billions of clips produced each year, and the small but persistent question of their environmental impact. For all the stunts and world records, the far more pressing reality is that paperclips are produced in staggering numbers every year. Billions of them leave factories, boxed by the pound, destined for drawers, filing cabinets, and eventually the floor under a desk. Most are lost before they are broken. Some survive long enough to rust. Very few are recycled in any meaningful sense. On paper, the clip should be an ideal candidate for recycling. It is made almost entirely of steel wire, sometimes coated with nickel or plastic. Steel is one of the most recyclable materials on Earth, infinitely reusable with little loss of quality. A paperclip tossed into a recycling bin should, in theory, reappear one day as a new clip, a car part, or even part of a bridge. In practice, things rarely work out that neatly. The problem is scale. A single paperclip weighs about a gram. Even a box of 100 amounts to little more than a handful of change. Recycling facilities are built to handle cars, appliances, and building materials, not stray grams of bent wire. Most clips disappear into the general waste stream, their recyclability defeated by their own insignificance. For every one that makes it to a smelter, thousands end up in landfills or vacuum cleaners. Plastic-coated clips complicate the picture further. The thin sheath of colour that once looked cheerful on an office memo turns into a minor nuisance in recycling plants, where coatings must be burned or stripped away. The environmental benefit of producing a bright pink clip is negligible at best, offset by the annoyance of separating steel from plastic. Many facilities simply discard them, proving that even in sustainability, boring beats decorative. And yet, despite their numbers, the global footprint of paperclips is almost invisible. Compared to packaging waste, electronics, or construction debris, clips barely register. Their very smallness makes them environmentally harmless in aggregate, even if individually wasteful. The worst they usually inflict is a rust mark on a forgotten document, or the occasional discovery of a bent wire lodged in a carpet years after it fell. Some enthusiasts have tried to turn paperclip recycling into a cause, collecting them in bulk for scrap drives or art projects. The effort is admirable, but often symbolic, a reminder that even the smallest object participates in the broader cycle of consumption. If nothing else, it highlights the strange truth that we can lose billions of clips each year without noticing, proof of their abundance and perhaps their disposability. Environmental impact, then, is not what defines the paperclip. What it reveals instead is how civilization treats the trivial, producing it by the ton, wasting it by the handful, and rarely pausing to notice. And once questions of waste are raised, attention naturally drifts to the ways manufacturers have tried to dress up the clip to justify making even more of them. After the gem clip had secured its dominance, manufacturers were left with a problem. How do you keep selling billions of an object that already works well enough? The answer, as in so many industries, was not improvement but decoration. If the shape couldn't be changed without ruining its function, perhaps the surface could. This was the origin of designer and colored paperclips. Plastic coatings arrived first, promising clips that wouldn't rust, wouldn't snag, and most importantly, wouldn't look so dull. Early models appeared in muted tones, blues and reds that matched ink colors. From there, the palette expanded into greens, yellows, and eventually neon shades that glowed under fluorescent lighting. By the 1980s and 1990s, you could buy entire boxes of rainbow assortments, marketed as a way to brighten your files. What this meant in practice was that accountants could now lose pink clips in carpets as easily as grey ones. Colour offered small advantages. Coated clips resisted rust stains that sometimes marked papers when bare steel was used. The coating also gave a smoother slide, making them slightly easier to apply. But the real benefit was psychological. Stacks of paperwork could be grouped by colour, giving clerks the illusion of organisation. Students used different hues to separate notes by subject. Offices distributed packs in bulk, imagining they were making administrative work more cheerful. The actual work remained the same, only more vividly accessorized. Novelty didn't stop at solid colors. Some companies experimented with transparent coatings, glitter-filled plastics, and even scented versions. These products rarely lasted long, partly because glitter belongs nowhere near a payroll department, and partly because a clip that smells like strawberries solves a problem no one has. Still, they reinforced the idea that the paperclip could be sold as more than bent wire. It could be sold as a lifestyle choice, or at least as a stationery fashion statement. Corporate branding also found its way onto clips. Promotional companies offered custom coatings with logos or mascots, sometimes bending clips into shapes that reflected a client's initials. These rarely worked well. A clip shaped like the letter S often failed to hold papers without warping, but companies persisted, convinced that handing out branded wire at trade shows would secure customer loyalty. Most recipients quietly discarded them after a single use, proving that even in marketing, boring still outperforms ambitious. Designer clips carved out a niche in stationery shops as well. Packs of pastel-coated clips were sold to match themed notebooks and folders, targeted especially towards students and writers. Matching a clip to a pen might not improve productivity, but it offered the small satisfaction of consistency. For some buyers, that was enough. The irony is that these designer variations rarely lasted in professional environments. Accountants, lawyers, and administrators consistently drifted back to plain steel, not because it was exciting, but because it did the job with no fuss. Bright colors chipped, coatings peeled, and novelty shapes snagged in folders. The unadorned gem clip survived because it was predictable, the one trait office supplies are most valued for. Still, the era of designer clips proved a point. Even the dullest object can be dressed up and sold as new, and while color and branding kept factories busy, the real business of the paperclip remained its scale. The global trade of billions of units worth only fractions of a cent. The real story of the paperclip is not design or decoration, but economics. Few objects illustrate the logic of mass production more clearly. A single clip costs a fraction of a cent to manufacture. Sold by the box, by the hundred, or by the pound, they generate profits not through price, but through sheer volume. The paperclip is, in effect, the pocket change of the industrial world. Factories churn out billions of them annually. The cost of materials is minimal, a thin strand of steel wire, often recycled, drawn out and bent by machines that run almost continuously. Packaging and distribution usually costs more than the clips themselves. The cardboard box is often worth more than the wire inside it. Yet because offices demand reliability and bulk, producers can count on steady sales year after year. Competition is fierce, but oddly unglamorous. Companies distinguish themselves not through innovation, but through price, packaging, and distribution contracts. A government office or school district might order thousands of boxes at a time, turning paperclips into a predictable line item in budgets. Nobody notices the expense, but manufacturers thrive on the steady trickle of institutional demand. Occasionally, marketing attempts to dress up the numbers. Clips are sold in economy packs, professional packs, or premium rust-resistant editions. The differences are negligible, but the labels reassure buyers that they are making a considered choice. In truth, almost every clip performs identically, regardless of how the box is branded. It is capitalism's closest approach to selling air, except air doesn't usually come in neon colors. One of the strangest episodes in paperclip economics involved the online barter story of Kyle MacDonald, who in 2005 famously traded a single red paperclip through a series of swaps that eventually led to acquiring a house. The tale was celebrated as proof of creative negotiation, but it also underscored the absurdity of value. A paperclip, practically worthless in itself, became the seed of a transaction chain worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Economists might describe it as an experiment in market dynamics. Everyone else saw it as a reminder that boredom occasionally pays off. In global terms, the industry surrounding paperclips is minuscule compared to electronics, automobiles, or textiles, yet its persistence is remarkable. Entire factories dedicate themselves to nothing else, their survival dependent on the fact that offices will always lose more clips than they use. The business model relies not on durability, but on disappearance. If every clip ever made were recovered and reused, production would grind to a halt overnight. Fortunately for manufacturers, humanity is astonishingly good at losing them. This small economy, built on fractions of pennies and billions of units, has carried the clip through more than a century of uninterrupted production. It is proof that adequacy, multiplied at scale, becomes profit. And while accountants tallied sales, philosophers and commentators began to notice the clip's symbolic weight, not as a commodity, but as a metaphor for efficiency, order, and even futility. Everyday objects rarely invite philosophy, but the paperclip has been pressed into service as a symbol more often than one might expect. Its plainness, its ubiquity, and its modest function have made it an easy canvas for metaphor. Writers, thinkers, and even casual observers have used the clip to illustrate ideas about order, impermanence, and the strange intersection of usefulness and futility. One recurring theme is efficiency. The paperclip represents the minimalist solution, the least effort required to accomplish a task. It holds papers together without damaging them, asks nothing in return, and expects to be forgotten. For some, this embodies the ideal of quiet competence, a reminder that progress is sometimes achieved not through grand invention, but through modest adequacy. Philosophers of technology occasionally point to the paperclip as proof that simplicity can outlast complexity. At the same time, the clip has been invoked as a symbol of futility. Its hold is temporary, its strength minimal, its presence easily overlooked. A paperclip never promises permanence, and in that sense it reflects the fragile nature of human organization itself. Offices filled with files may appear orderly, but the whole system is one bent wire away from collapse into loose pages. The metaphor is irresistible to anyone inclined towards cynicism about bureaucracy. Psychologists have even used the clip in thought experiments. The paperclip maximizer, a scenario proposed in discussions of artificial intelligence, imagines a machine programmed to maximize the number of paperclips. Given unlimited power, it would consume the universe, converting all matter into clips. The example is absurd, but it illustrates the danger of unchecked goals. A simple object becomes the basis for debates about the future of humanity. For artists and poets, the paperclip sometimes stands for connection itself, the smallest possible link between things. Unlike chains or locks, it binds loosely, reversibly, without ceremony. It connects, but only tentatively. In this sense, it has been used as a metaphor for relationships, ideas, or even memory. Not all connections are meant to last, and the paperclip captures that fragile truth more accurately than sturdier symbols. Of course, most people never think about the paperclip in any of these ways. It remains in drawers, used and discarded without comment. The philosophy comes not from the clip itself, but from the human tendency to search for meaning, even in bent wire. That tendency says more about us than about the object. From metaphor and thought experiment, the story of the paperclip eventually collided with the digital age, an era where the physical clip began to lose ground, even as its image became immortalized in software. The arrival of computers promised to reduce paperwork, and with it, the need for paperclips. Offices shifted from typewriters and filing cabinets to monitors and databases, leaving fewer stacks of paper to corral. Predictions of a paperless office circulated as early as the 1970s. For the paperclip, this sounded like an early retirement plan. Reality was less decisive. Paper didn't vanish. Reports, contracts, and forms still had to be printed, signed, and archived. What changed was the scale. A company that once consumed boxes of clips each month found itself using fewer, but never quite zero. The paperclip became a background player, less central, but still present whenever a signature or hard copy was required. The digital age also preserved the paperclip in an unexpected way, as an icon. Email applications adopted the image of a small clip to represent attachments. This visual metaphor was so intuitive that few users even questioned it. Millions of people now encounter paperclips daily on their screens, even if they rarely touch one in real life. Ironically, the clip's most enduring role in the 21st century may be entirely symbolic. Of course, no discussion of the digital era is complete without mentioning Clippy, Microsoft's animated assistant introduced in 1997. Shaped as a cheerful paperclip with eyes, it offered unsolicited tips in Microsoft Office. Clippy's intentions were good, but its execution was disastrous. Users found its interruptions irritating, its advice unhelpful, and its persistence legendary. Within a few years, it became a punchline, a reminder that not every office supply is improved by personality. Yet Clippy also ensured that an entire generation would remember the paperclip, if only with mild annoyance. Despite predictions, paper consumption actually rose in the early years of digital adoption, as emails were printed and documents duplicated. Only later did the shift toward PDFs and cloud storage reduce the flood. Today, paperclips survive in niches, legal offices, schools, and any environment where signatures and physical records remain essential. They are not gone, merely less visible. The digital age, then, didn't destroy the paperclip. It relocated it. From boxes on shelves to icons on screens, from physical presence to symbolic shorthand. The tool that once held contracts together now holds digital attachments in the imagination. Its future may not lie in steel wire, but in pixels. And with the clip's symbolic life secured, the final question becomes what role it will play in the years ahead. Will it fade with paper, or continue as the quietest emblem of office life? Speculating about the future of paperclips is, in some ways, like speculating about the future of shoelaces. They are simple, functional, and unlikely to disappear entirely, yet no one expects breakthroughs or revolutions. The question is not whether the paperclip will be reinvented, but whether paper itself will remain common enough to justify its existence. Trends suggest a slow decline. Digital signatures, electronic records, and cloud storage all reduce the need for physical documents. Many offices that once consumed boxes of clips each year now keep a single pack that seems to last indefinitely. Schools assign work through tablets, companies circulate reports by email, and governments scan archives into searchable databases. Each shift takes a few more papers out of circulation, and with them, a few more clips. But obsolescence is rarely absolute. Hospitals still keep hard copies of patient charts. Lawyers still shuffle contracts. Students still print essays, if only to turn them in physically. In all of these contexts, the paperclip remains useful, precisely because it is so cheap and so unambitious. A box costs little, takes up no space, and waits patiently for the rare moments when nothing else will do. There is also the symbolic afterlife to consider. The image of the clip as an icon for attachments is unlikely to vanish soon, even if the physical object fades. It has become too familiar, too embedded in daily digital life. Long after offices stop buying clips by the pound, people may still click on the tiny wire symbol to send files across the world. In that sense, the paperclip may survive longer in pixels than in steel. As for innovation, It is difficult to imagine a future of biodegradable clips, nano clips, or smart clips equipped with sensors would solve problems no one has ever had. The enduring lesson of the gem design is that adequacy is enough. A tool perfected not by brilliance but by indifference rarely attracts research and development. What remains then is perspective. The paperclip has held together memos, school essays, resistance movements, intelligence operations, and internet jokes. It has been traded up to a house, built into monuments, and animated into a cartoon assistant. It has been produced by the billions, lost by the billions, and remembered mainly for being unremarkable. Perhaps that is its true achievement: invisibility. The paperclip does not demand attention, yet it has quietly touched nearly every desk on Earth for more than a century. Few inventions can claim such reach while inspiring so little enthusiasm. And so, having followed the story of bent wire from factory floors to computer screens, we arrive at the inevitable conclusion: the paperclip is boring, and it always has been, which is why it has earned its place in the Boring Files series.